Ladies and gentlemen, we want to start. Commissioner Malmström, Excellencies, Members of Parliament, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to our panel discussion, Missing Links, Making Trade Work for Workers, where we will explore future avenues for the social dimensions of EU trade policies. Trade and the impacts of globalization, such as rising inequality, are subjects of a lot of pressure and harsh criticism these days. And the changing nature also of international trade dominated by global value chains has led to downward pressure on working conditions. Fundamental rights at work, such as the right to organize and bargain collectively, are not upheld. Child labor exists still in many supply chains, and minimum wages when paid are not sufficient to ensure decent living standards. Forced overtime and lack of safety measures are also common. And today we will present our latest research findings and policy recommendations. All are outputs of the regional project Core Labour Standards Plus, which was launched by the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung in 2016. And the scope of this project is rather ambitious in the sense that it goes beyond the ILO core labour standards, which includes important rights such as living wages, maximum working hours, including overtime and safe and healthy workplaces. And in the first phase of this project, local researchers in 4 countries, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Pakistan and Vietnam, explored the link between trade and labour standards in key industries characterized by global value chains, namely apparel, textile, footwear and electronics. You find a summary of the results published here, I think in the rear over there, and the long versions of the country studies will be published and go online within the next weeks. And in the second phase of the project, we first assessed the promotional and the conditional approach to the inclusion of labour standards in social chapters within trade agreements in order to provide valuable policy recommendations for future trade agreement designs and trade policy instruments to improve compliance with labour standards and law. And second, we calculated that potentially more than €6 billion in tariffs will be saved from 2018 until 2025, when the European Union-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement enters into force in 2018 in order to discuss who will benefit most from tariff suspension in free trade agreements and what should we do with the money. Given that all these findings claim that the current trade agreements are not supporting the compliance of labour standards, one then developed a model labour clause for future trade agreements in cooperation with Bernd Lange, Chair of the EU Committee on International Trade and Member of the European Parliament, and which will be presented later on in the panel discussion by Bernd Lange. The model labour clause presents a progressive, from our point of view, a progressive and ambitious approach to secure and enhance the protection of workers in future trade agreements. The model chapter first notably includes important yet often underrepresented standards on occupational safety and health, decent living wages and working hours. Second, empowers social partners and civil society organizations to participate and monitor all labour-related activities of the parties. And third, includes an effective dispute settlement between the parties and the collective complaint procedure, while effective enforcement is available through remedies, namely consensual compensation, monetary assessment and the suspension of obligations. All this research, of course, we are a political foundation, was greatly supported by knowledge sharing with and discussions with and comments of local trade unions, but also the Global Labour University and global union federations. I would like to thank all those who have contributed to the project with their knowledge and insights and helped to provide policy recommendations to make future trade agreements and policy more effective and enforcing labour standards and law. And now I'm very much looking forward to our panel discussion and to the panelists. Thank you very much for your willingness to participate and to share your views with us. And I wish us all a fruitful discussion. But to start with, I want to ask Dr. Chi for a brief overview on the research results, mainly on Vietnam. Ms. Chi is the director at Research Center for Employment Relations in Vietnam. The floor is yours, and afterwards, our excellent moderator, Philipp Blenkinsop from Reuters, will bring you through the program. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. First of all, I'd like to thank the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung for giving me the rare chance to conduct this important research in Vietnam. And I'd like to thank Mr. Bernd Lange and the EU Parliament for giving me this rare opportunity to share with you the outcome of our research. Next slide, please. Okay, so we started this research in Vietnam with the question of whether or not more international trade for Vietnam will bring fairer trade and benefits for the workers or not. So we know that 80%, 85% of international trade is now occurring in the global value chains. And Vietnam has already joined 16 different free trade agreements. And we achieve an export growth of over 10% per year. And if you look at the graph here, you can see the line at the top is the GDP per capita of Vietnam between 2001 and 2013. And it increased steadily at a high rate. However, the 4 lines below are the real minimum wages for different regions in Vietnam. And as you can see here, actually, they are increasing, but in a very unstable rate and a much lower rate than the GDP per capita. So this triggers a question for us when we conduct this research. Whether or not when Vietnam joined more FTAs, we have more international trade, does it mean that we have fairer trade? And will the benefits of free trade trickle down to the workers or not? So first of all, briefly about Vietnam and the 3 industries we are talking about. We did research on 3 industries which are the backbone of the export industries in Vietnam: the ready-made garment, sports shoes, and smartphones. For example, in 2015, smartphones account for 19% of our total export value, followed by garments 17% and footwear 7%. And also the 3 exporting industries also employ a lot of workers. As you can see here, garment, for example, employed 2.5 million people, 1 million in footwear, and over 300,000 in electronics. What is also very characteristic of these industries is that the rank and file labor force of all 3 industries are predominantly female. So 70% on average of the rank and file labor force in these 3 industries are women. Next, please. And as Mr. Steenhuppel just shared, if we can have the EU-Vietnam FTA, then by the best case, between 2018 until 2025, the accumulated savings from tariff reduction will be around 6 billion euro. So what we found from this study is that, first of all, the brands or the buyers, international buyers, in all 3 industries have monopoly power over their suppliers. The monopoly power here is when we have a lot of sellers, or in this case we call the suppliers, but there are only a small number of buyers, or sometimes we call them brands. So the suppliers will have to compete with each other to sell to a small number of powerful brands. Therefore, the brands will have the monopoly power in their supply chains. So we talk a lot about the brands and suppliers in garment, but we found that the monopoly power of the brands is most intense in electronics, because the electronics market, especially the smartphone market, is characterized or is dominated by a very small number of big international brands and a lot of suppliers. The second thing that we found from this study is that labor cost is not a factor at all in the negotiations between the brands and their suppliers in all of the 3 industries. Next, please. So say, for example, if you look at ready-made garment supply chain in Vietnam, you can see in the graph, it is the nominal price of apparel exports from Vietnam, China, and Bangladesh to America in 10 years between 2005 and 2015. And if you see the red line on the top, which is Vietnam, you can see that over the past decade, actually, the nominal price of apparel exports from Vietnam to America reduced slightly. Next, please. And we found the same thing in footwear. We interviewed the manufacturing companies of very big footwear, sports shoes brands, and they said that the assembly price or the manufacturing price imposed on them by Adidas and Nike have not changed at all over the past 5 years. And it has always been $11 per pair for Adidas and $12 per pair for Nike. And according to the suppliers, they say that these prices are unnegotiable. They just take it or leave it. Back to slide 5, please. Okay, so at the same time, the brands, due to their monopoly power, they have all the authority and the power to structure the supply chains to their best benefit. So the benefit of the brands is that they stick to some of the bigger East Asian suppliers. In the case of Vietnam, they are mostly from Taiwan, South Korea, or China. And because these suppliers are very, very big, the biggest in footwear, for example, employ 100,000 workers in one factory. And thanks to economy of scale, they are able to offer the brands with lower cost, lower prices. So when the brands structure their supply chains in such a way, they marginalized the domestic companies from the supply chains. And this is most extreme in the case of electronic or the smartphone supply chain. In a big Korean, South Korean smartphone supply chains, we found that among 108 suppliers that they have in Vietnam, only 11 are Vietnamese companies. The rest are all Korean suppliers. And also, the assembly suppliers of the manufacturers, the factories, they are the ones who get the smallest share in the global supply chain. And as you can see, that because the price is already imposed and unchanged, the only thing that these companies, the suppliers, can do is to lower the cost, factory cost, including, and most importantly, the labor cost. Next, please. And next, please. Yes. So this is one example that we found in the study about the strategy to minimize cost of one sports shoe company. It's a big sports shoes company producing for Adidas. And as you can see in the graph, the blue line is the value of production per month in US dollar. The green line is wage paid to the workers. And the red line is the number of workers used for each production line. And as you can see, the production value, this company has been able to increase by 31% per year in the period of 2013 to 2050. That's huge. But the number of workers per production line reduced from 80 per line in 2013 to only 60 in 2015. How about the wages? As you can see, the wages did increase slightly, but it increased because of the increase of minimum wage, because the workers are paid at the minimum wage level plus only 5% for seniority. Next, please. So what else that we found? When we talk to the brands, they always say about their CSR campaigns and how much they're investing in CSR standards to ensure that the suppliers in their supply chain will comply with international labor standards. But we found that actually there is very little linkage between the procurement strategy that the brands are using and their CSR policy. And this is true for all of the 3 industries that we studied. And what we found is actually there is a conflicting, inherent conflict of the business models that the fast fashion brands in all 3 industries are pursuing and their CSR values, CSR standards. Because when they ask the suppliers to comply with their CSR standards, that will be very likely to increase the cost for the companies, for the factories. At the same time, the procurement team use their power to put pressure on the suppliers to lower the cost. And we found evidence of garment suppliers reporting that they have to reduce the factory cost by 5 to 10% a year. So you can see on one hand, CSR standards will raise the cost for the suppliers. On the other hand, procurement strategy just push down the cost. So what is the consequence of that conflict in the business model of these fast fashion brands? First of all, we found that the suppliers, especially domestic suppliers, that have good labor practices, but they are not able to keep the cost down, have been gradually driven out of these global supply chains. And those who can stay are the bigger suppliers who are able to minimize their cost, their labor cost, but at the same time faking their compliance with the CSR standards. Next, please. So what is the real labor practices in these three industries? And our common perception is that, the labor conditions in garment is really bad, and we have a lot of international projects trying to help, raising labor standards in garment and textile. But we found that actually the labor standards in electronics are the worst of the three industries. It doesn't mean that in garment it's already good. It doesn't mean in footwear it's already good. But I mean the situation in electronics is the worst. Why? We often say that, workers in electronics, they have higher pay. It's true. But it's not the basic salary that is higher. Basic salary just at minimum wage level. But they get 35 to 50% of their income coming from overtime work. And excessive overtime is the norm in electronic supply chain. And as you can see in the graph here, it's the life cycle of a typical electronics product. And you can see that the production peaked just at the launch of the product. So 6 months before the launch of that product, the workers in the whole supply chains will have to work a lot of overtimes. And we found that workers in this supply chain, specific one, work up to 100 hours of overtime per month. But after a while, when the production slowed down, at the end of the cycle, which is about 1 year after the launch, the workers will not have enough work to do, and many of the workers reported that they have to stay at home for 2 to 3 days a week, receiving only 70% of basic salary because of the lack of production in the low seasons. We also found evidence of gender discrimination and social dialogue in the electronic supply chain is the worst compared to garment and footwear. And also one more finding is that if one supplier managed to sell to more than one brand, then the labor standards in that suppliers tend to be better than those who are selling only to one brand. If you're only selling to one brand, the leverage of the brand is super. And then you always have to reduce cost, and then you will not be able to have the margin to comply with labor standards. Next, please. And also we found that, the common perception is that foreign-owned companies have the better standards, have the better labor compliance. But we found domestic firms, especially the former state-owned companies, have better labor practices. For example, they are paying workers higher. They invested more in labor training. For example, on average, in our study, one foreign-owned companies in garment only have 3 days of training per year for their workers. But the former state-owned company, domestic companies, have 30 days of training for their workers. And they also have a wide range of communication and grievance mechanism at the workplace, and they offer generous welfare benefits. But these domestic firms, because they are unable to lower their cost, their prices, they are marginalized from the global supply chain. And as you can see here, actually, the FDI sector, the foreign-owned sector, is contributing 77 to 90% of export values in footwear, garment, and electronics. Next, please. So what we learned from this? The study showed that at the moment, if we have more international trade, more engagement into international trade, for economies like Vietnam and with the current model of trade and sustainability chapter, more trade will mean more benefits will go to the brands and the bigger suppliers, the East Asian suppliers, rather than workers or the domestic companies. So can we have fairer trade through free trade agreements or not? I believe that the sustainability chapter should be remodeled, redesigned to promote shared prosperity. So I very much look forward to the panel discussion which follow. Thank you very much.
So speak slowly. Thank you very much. So my name is Philip Blenkinsop. I cover a variety of subjects, particularly international trade for Reuters. I'm your moderator today, but obviously there is no moderation without a panel. I will briefly introduce them. They are listed in your programme, but obviously we have Cecilia Malmström, who's the European Commissioner for Trade. Okay, good. You've got one. Bernd Lange, who needs almost no introduction here, obviously is the chairman of the Committee of International Trade and an MEP. Ken Ash, on my left, is Director of Trade and Agriculture at the OECD. And Corinne Varga, I'm pronouncing that correctly? Okay, is Director at International Labour Standards Department at the ILO. So perhaps without further ado, I think the plan is essentially that we give the panellists 5 to 7 minutes with the stress on 5 over 7, which by my basic maths should allow us then to have a kind of discussion and open the floor to questions for about an hour. So I think we'll kick off with the host broadcaster, so that's Mr. Lange.
Thanks a lot. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks a lot for coming and joining this discussion. And this, I think, is kind of kick-off on the discussion of improved labour chapter in trade agreements. And it's certainly clear that a trade agreement and even a labour chapter in a trade agreement will not solve all problems we are faced with. But, on the other hand, I think trade agreements and labour chapters are one instrument to improve the situation. And I think regarding the presentation, it's totally clear that we are faced with a split picture of globalization and value chain. On the one hand, it brings work, it stimulates growth, but on the other hand, an unregulated globalization and global value chain give pressure to the working condition. So the consequence, of course, is that we have to strengthen the universal labour law, the 8 core labour standards, to give the workers the possibility to bargain, to fight for their wages and, of course, for security and the living conditions. So this is, I think, evident as a consequence of the situation we are faced with. No doubt about, in the last years, there is an increase in labour provision in trade agreements. In the year 2000, only 10% of trade agreements we have labour provision. Now we have in 80% of trade agreements labour provision. So there is an increase. But, of course, the better is the enemy of the good. Sometimes I think we have to reflect if the labour chapter we have introduced are really reflecting the necessities we are faced with in specific countries. So I'm totally convinced that we have to discuss a further improvement, and we in the European Union had a discussion on the CETA file, where we, as European Parliament, asked for further improvement, especially regarding the enforcement mechanism of a labour agreement. So we call it CETA Plus. The study, it was called Labour Standards Plus, so the plus is the moment we are discussing. Huh? So, and what does it mean? And to discuss this, of course, I looked in several different trade agreements. There are some promising examples, especially our partner on CETA, Canada, made some really good examples, the Canadians-South Korean agreement, and now they adopted one with Chile, the first time they introduced gender equality in this agreement. So there are also partners worldwide where we can discuss this. And I'm really proud to present today draft of a progressive trade chapter. I discussed it, of course, with the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation, but also with Professor Stoll and his commandants from Göttingen, by the way, the university I studied in. And they are, of course, here and ready to answer questions in details, especially, of course, after the discussion here on the podium. And we tried to base our work on some examples and on the model we developed in the last 10 years. So that's not, let's say, a revolution, more an evolution. And let me just raise 6 points where perhaps a new approach can be found in the draft chapter. First of all, the content. 2 minutes, 3 minutes. The content, the 8 core labor standards, but a little bit going ahead, make clear what the real content is. So that collective bargaining means also strike and the possibility to have strike, and this is not in line, for example, with Korea, with the criminal law. Therefore, the integration of the core labor standards and the definition, what does it mean, is one of the key parts. Secondly, implementation by involvement. We want to strengthen the participation of civil society, especially the domestic advisory groups, give clear procedures and clear rights. So we have the problem in the Korean one as well, that the domestic advisors have some clear messages but have not the possibility to get the procedures starting. Thirdly, we want also to enforce the domestic possibilities, labor inspection, the judicial proceedings, so that a claim is possible on domestic procedures, and of course some strong CSR obligations. Fourth, we want to promote labor standards. I think it's important as a common target, but also for international cooperation, so that also bilateral agreements have an influence to further development. Fifthly, we want to have also guaranteed compliance. So we developed dispute settlement mechanism in 2 directions. In the more classical party-to-party direction, with consultation, with a compliance procedure, and then an enforcement assessment. And we introduce, and that's quite new, the possibility of a collective possibilities to get a claim in the process, so that individual workers or trade unions can use this instrument as well. And here again, the domestic advisory group is playing a role. This domestic group should have the right to initiate a party-to-party dispute settlement mechanism. And sixthly, compensation. Of course, we discussed what would be the proper measure to compensate for a violation against the core labor standards. I think the monetary assessment, the monetary compensation is the best one, so that the workers and the organization have the possibility to create measures against the violation that is much better than the last possibility to reduce the obligations from the trade agreement. This is the core of the new model, and I hope that we can start a productive discussion on an improvement of trade, of the labour chapter and trade agreements, so that at the end of the day we can give Xi a proper answer. Thanks a lot for the attention.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lange. Thank you for keeping to, well, I think you were 7 to 8 minutes, so that's not too bad. So, Ms. Malmström, maybe you can take the...
I will. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. Thank you to the Intercommittee and Chairman Lange for organising this. It is very timely indeed, very important subject, and as you said, a little bit of a kick-off to discuss this. I don't think we'll find all the solutions today, but we can maybe get a clearer picture of the different alternatives, the different debates that are out there. This session is called Making Trade Work for Workers, and I would like to claim that in many ways trade already does work for workers. In the European Union today, 31 million jobs depend on export only. And for many different sectors, that is high-skilled and low-skilled. And then, of course, you have several additional millions who are dependent on imports. So there are lots of workers involved in this already. So strengthening global trade creates more jobs and helps European workers. So this is the starting point I would like to come from. I would very much like to see that we continue to push for trade based on values. Trade is a way to shape globalisation. You set up rules, you create predictability. It is not a race to the bottom. So promoting and enforcing issues like worker rights and the environment, which are also important when you talk about sustainable development, even if we focus on workers' rights today. Now, as has been said, trade cannot solve all the problems of the world. I wish it could. But when we do sit down as a European Union, a big market, the biggest trader of the world, if we have decent, realistic negotiating objectives and an openness to engage, we can achieve quite a lot. We include trade and sustainable development chapter now in all our trade agreements, and we level the playing field. Our partners are required to take up major international global labour and environmental principles, implement them effectively, and not to lower them in order to encourage investment or trade. We sit with our partners at the table to ensure that it happens, respect for workers' rights, labour standards, environment, natural resources. We work in partnership with the civil society, and we fund a lot of projects on implementation. The example of Vietnam was mentioned. Thank you very much. It was an extremely interesting study. I'll be happy to read it in full. I am convinced that, of course, there are lots of problems, that it could help that country grow and develop and support jobs. And we are starting to see how we can work on the implementation, working with OECD and ILO and for the different civil society bodies. And the approach we take on this is enforceable, it is binding, and there are tailored mechanisms to settle disputes. We base ourselves on multilateral rules, institutions, systems, referring to agreed, accepted international conventions, and working with partners, as I said, OECD, ILO, and others. So there is no confusion of what kind of standards we have. And that is a very good way to shape globalisation and to strengthen the global governance. And it fits with the global value chains and modern economy. And this is a long-term engagement, of course, that can build lasting change. And we have established unprecedented new civil society structures in countries where they've been very weak. From Canada to Central America, we have seen countries sign up to international conventions as we conduct trade negotiations. And we are making progress in Latin America, in Asia, in Georgia, to take a neighbouring country. And this is a combined effort, of course, by governments, civil society, ILO and others. Now, there are other models out there, the North American model, the North American model, that some find more attractive. But it's not a silver bullet, because sanctions are tailored very narrowly to where a practice impacts bilateral trade exchanges. And these are not easy to impose. Proving injury is not straightforward. In reality, neither the US or Canada has ever used them for labour or environmental issues. The only case that the US triggered in 2011 against Guatemala, labour right violation, they lost the case because it was very difficult to prove it. Not that it didn't take place, the violation, but it was very difficult to prove, so sanctions could not apply. So in reality, most of the labour and environmental issues do not fall into the scope of the US-style measures. By the EU provisions, they could be, including cases like Guatemala. Now, our model is not perfect, and it has a lot of shortcomings, even if overall I think it works. So we could find ways to improve it, short of taking a narrow sanction-based approach. We can better prioritise, we can organise our resources, we can ensure commitments are really implemented. We can listen to civil society more and other stakeholders, and we can respond more quickly. We can take up better on complaints about alleged non-compliance of the provisions. We can talk more with our partners, we can follow up, and we can monitor the results. In our current systems, we have used the monitoring mechanism, but we have never used the dispute settlement process. And I think we shouldn't be afraid to do so when needed. And I have made clear that we could use that option with the Korean government. Now, of course, there's a new government, so we need to liaise with them before using this, and I will do this as soon as they are fully in place. So together, this could be a tougher approach that could apply to these agreements, but possibly also those in the future, but also agreed ones. So I'm open to debate, open to evidence. We will be launching a paper setting out different options and proposals very soon. I hope this can trigger the debate as well. But we should be, of course, very open about the pros and cons of different alternatives. There are no easy ways to fix. We can all recognise the problems and we can all be very upset, and we are, but there are no easy ways. So I welcome very much your input to this. I'll be happy to look into more detail to that study, our debate today, and looking forward to engage with the Parliament and all of you here today, of course. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. All right. I think we've agreed to move to Mr. Ash next, who is, just to remind you, Director of Trade and Agriculture at the OECD.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here at the beginning of this conversation. After all the references to Canada, I feel obligated to confess that I'm a Canadian. I haven't lived there for almost 20 years, but that's my pedigree. I'm going to speak to a paper we released at the OECD within the last few weeks. It's called Making Trade Work for All. I'm not going to bother you with the analytical findings. I want to jump right to the punchline. In our view, to make trade work better for women and men, consumers and workers in developing and developed countries, we need a much more integrated approach to policy. We need to get out of our comfortable policy silos. It's not just about trade agreements. It's not just about trade policy. It's about much more than that. We have three broad areas that we advise governments to move forward on a little more urgently than they've done to date. The first, creating the environment at home where benefits, potential theoretical benefits from trade can actually materialize. So this means reducing in particular those unnecessary costs that policies can sometimes impose on firms in domestic markets as well as firms that wish to trade. One area in particular I want to emphasize are some of the restrictions in place in domestic regulations that impede the capacity of firms in service sectors. Our analysis suggests that we can reduce costs by getting rid of unnecessary regulations by between 3 and 38%. This is enormous. These unnecessary costs fall disproportionately on small firms and on young firms, where most of the new employment, new opportunities come from. Of course, it also means investing much more in people, in lifelong education and training that equip women and men with the skills to adapt to changing economies, and all of our economies are changing. It means connecting people and places to jobs and markets through both physical and digital infrastructure, increasingly the latter. Secondly, we need to do much more to bring everyone along. This means active labour market policies and social safety nets that work, and work as intended. And many of the automatic stabilizers in many of our economies have not stabilized as planned over the past decade. It also means investing in health, education, and activation frameworks that make work pay, promoting mobility and labour market inclusion by linking entitlements to people, not to specific jobs, targeting measures to revitalise regional economies where trade or other shocks can be concentrated, and of course by, where possible, anticipating future challenges, whether digitalisation, robotics, or anything else you can imagine. Thirdly, and this is probably what you want to hear more about, but you're not going to hear exactly what you probably want to hear, making the international system work better by harnessing the full range of international economic cooperation tools. This means increasing public engagement. The Commissioner has talked about this, and the EU in many ways leads countries in this effort. It also means, though, addressing unfinished business in agriculture, in various aspects of competition policy, and it means doing more to ensure compliance with agreed international standards. So doing what we all agreed to do. This shared aim is to ensure that trade agreements are governed by fair rules, that businesses operate responsibly, that labour and environmental standards are respected, that cross-border tax arrangements are enforced, and that corruption and bribery is combated. Now, international economic cooperation tools today include a wide range of both legal and soft law measures, binding trade rules with dispute settlement at the WTO, both hard and soft measures in various RTAs, ILO core labour standards and any improvements that are advanced to them, OECD guidelines on multinational enterprises, responsible business conduct, due diligence in supply chains, tax initiatives like automatic exchange, base erosion, profit shifting, anti-bribery, anti-corruption conventions. There is a continuum of hard law all the way down to maybe countries and companies should talk a little more to each other and better still listen a little more to each other. Now, an important part of this debate is about the role of trade and trade agreements. What I want to do is, I have 2 minutes? Talk a little bit about labour standards and working conditions, which go to the heart of whether people believe the system is fair. Yet there remain significant differences across countries on how these issues should be taken forward in the context of economic cooperation, in or out of a trade agreement. Some countries fear disguised protectionism by the imposition of standards. Sometimes there's unexpected consequences. We heard the terrific example from the lead speaker. You impose corporate social responsibility, and the impact is what? To worsen, in the end, conditions. This is a problem. It's more complicated than A leads to B. There's also a significant variable that we shouldn't lose sight of in terms of the institutional capacity in some developing countries. For example, if we wish to enforce a particular requirement in a country, and have that subject to binding dispute, if they don't have the capacity to do that, is there going to be support from the partner country? Is that support going to be financed, and is that support going to be adequate? So there's some very important questions here. Important international standards and monitoring mechanisms already exist, of course, in the form of the ILO core labour standards, the decent work agenda. And these play an incredibly and an increasingly important role in ensuring decent conditions for people and in avoiding exploitative conditions that can drive down costs and opportunities. And another important element in making the international system work better relates to responsible business conduct. The complexity, again, as has been pointed out already, of the value chain can make it very difficult to understand what is happening across the entire length of that chain, risking to undermine the level playing field for businesses and diluting the benefits for workers and for society more generally. So let me wrap up by saying making trade work for all requires a much improved approach and much improved outcomes in terms of international economic cooperation, but it also requires country-specific, national and subnational structural policies well aligned with the capacity to meet the competition that will come from more open markets both at home and abroad. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're still within time. We might just have an hour left before the discussion is complete, or at least the panel presentations are complete. So, Ms. Varga from the ILO, maybe give us your view.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having invited me. I'm going to bring to our discussion today some ILO perspective, and I'm going to selectively highlight a few findings of a recent study the ILO has done assessing the impact of trade agreements and their labor provision. And the one question I would like to address in my 5 minutes is, did labour provision help improve the social impact of trade, which I guess is the core question we want to be discussing here today. Our research point to the following findings. First, trade has had positive impact in terms of improving access to markets and decreasing price of imported goods. This in turn may have indeed increased the income of certain groups. However, our research points also to mixed findings in relation to the impact of trade on job quality and income distribution. So, turning now to this question of the impact of labour provisions and how can their impact be more effective and bigger than what we have been observing, we've highlighted 3 key elements that increase potentially the impact of labour provisions in trade agreements. The first element is the involvement of stakeholders, both in the design and in the implementation of trade agreements. In the negotiation phase, what we've been observing is that in many countries you have permanent consultation mechanisms that have been set up with fixed participation. However, the implementation of these mechanisms is still very limited in practice, so there is indeed room to improve full and active engagement of stakeholders in the negotiation phase through these consultation mechanisms. Second core element that our research suggests we need to be looking at is transparency of negotiation and implementation mechanism. Stakeholders have been expressing repeatedly to the ILO researchers their very limited satisfaction with the overall transparency of the trade negotiation process, and our study pointed to a related challenge to this overall transparency challenge, which is the need to enhance the dimension of accountability down the line. So it's not just about transparency, but it's also about improved accountability down the line. The third element which I would like to bring to your attention, which is critical to work on, is the coherence between trade agreements with respect to their reference of international labour standards. We've heard a number of speakers talking about ILO and labour standards before. Indeed, what we find is we have differences in terms of the normative content of trade agreements at present. We have also differences in terms of implementation mechanism between these trade agreements. And then I'd like also to bring one specific aspect to your attention, which relates to the non-labour elements of trade agreements, and in particular the investment provisions, which may, in some circumstances, constrain the capacity of government to implement sustainable labour policies. And this is very much echoing the presentation of the Vietnamese research we just heard at the beginning of our presentation. I think our research are echoing one another on that point. So now turning to the ILO potential contribution, as you've been hearing from the various speakers before me, the ILO is frequently called upon to collaborate with partners engaged in trade agreements, be it at the negotiation phase or during their implementation. And we typically associate it and called upon to provide first information, secondly advice, and thirdly technical assistance, which means we helping member states build their institutions and build their capacity. Why is it that the ILO is receiving these requests for technical assistance? I think this is pretty much also in line with one of the findings of our research so far is that signing parties to trade agreement generally prefer to engage in dialogue and cooperative activities to prevent and resolve dispute, as opposed to engaging in a dispute resolution mechanism or sanction or complaint mechanism. And precisely the ILO is being seen as a neutral third party, and areas among which we have relevant experience and expertise falls in the area of promoting dialogue, in particular between social partners, preventing and resolving disputes, labour disputes, and obviously expertise and experience with respect to labour standards. We also have a very well-established and robust supervisory system that monitors how ILO member states are implementing their ratified convention, so their international obligation with respect to labour standards. So last question, and I'd like to finish on some open question. Is the ILO collaboration delivering the expected impact as well? I would claim the ILO contribution does provide positive impact when there is political will, when there is commitment, and when there is adequate resource to support the development of national institutions and support the engagement of stakeholders and social partners in particular. However, let me point to 3 challenges here. I think time in itself is a challenge. We're faced with expectation of quick fixes and short-term results, which are often not easy, well, let me rather say impossible to meet, as we working on institution building and capacity building. Some of these activities require time to deliver reportable results. So we need to be better at identifying what can be done short term and what would require more medium term and longer term engagement. Then I'd like to echo my colleague from OECD and point to the need for improved policy coherence, and he might be surprised to hear me here, but it's true that, I mean, the comment I was making earlier, that the non-labor elements of trade agreements have an impact on the capacity of the labor provisions of a trade agreement also to deliver. So we need to be also looking at improved policy coherence between economic and social policies, investment policies, and the rest. In respect of that, the reference to the decent work agenda in your draft chapter, I find it interesting, because precisely one of the core elements promoted by the ILO decent work agenda is pushing for improved coherence between the various policies member states are implementing. And then the third challenge I think we need to be taking up is improved communication. I think there is perhaps far more that's being done than what's known, and I think there too we have room to improve. I hope I manage my time correctly.
I think you're bang on, and we do have an hour. Well, the advantage of being a moderator is that you get to ask the first question anyway, or the first questions. On a very kind of simplistic kind of basis, we had sort of suggestions and advice from this side, and this side was basically saying, well, it's very complicated. Obviously there was a lot more content than that, but one of the things that I was interested to find out is in a trade agreement, how much, and obviously your suggestion is we should go beyond the core labour standards, so maybe you've answered the question, but how much should there be in a trade agreement? And also there's a kind of question of balance, because presumably if you try to put too much in, or there's an argument, if you put too much in, it becomes unpalatable for the trading partner. Maybe you have experience of Ms. Malmström of dealing with other countries, and obviously there's the question of whether they respect their commitments. But is there a challenge in getting commitments from countries in trading partnerships in the first place? Clearly not Canada, but perhaps some of the other countries.
That is a very interesting question. With Canada, we have tried, which will enter into force any day now, is what we want to see as a role model or a template for our trade agreement. And in there, it was not that complicated because, of course, Canada, especially in the later phase of the negotiations, have a very progressive government. So in there we have chapters on sustainable development, we have references to ILO, we have references to sustainable development, international conventions, the Paris Agreement, we have texts on child labour, on corporate social responsibility, we even have text on animal welfare and antibiotics resistance in there. So everything that NGOs have been asking for in the past is in there. Now we want to work together, and we are also looking to be inspired by Canada. I think Bernd mentioned the issue of gender equality. We will soon be launching our trade negotiations with Chile, who has been very much the champions of this, and will in that negotiations also include a chapter on gender as a pilot project to see where we can do. But then there are calls to include corruption. We will do that. Good governance you mentioned as well. We will do that with Mexico. All these things are important and they are linked. But of course there is a point where our trade partners say that it's too much. And also negotiating all this takes several years. So finding that balance, promoting our values, never lowering any standards, make sure that we make the maximum of our strong position as the main trader of the world, but also realizing that some issues are actually domestic issues. We can't solve them. And if we don't even have legislation on our own in the European Union, we can't really lecture others on it either. So there is a balance. And then in the end, they will have to be ratified as well. And there's always, which is not an easy issue here in the European Union, but there will always be demand for more and more and more and more all the time. So I can't really answer exactly where their balance is. We have gone a long way to promote value-based trade. I am a strong supporter of this, but we will soon be reaching our limits. I think that doesn't mean that I don't think we can improve on all this and enforcement, absolutely. But there is a limit how much you can put into the trade agreements, because we do a lot of other things. We have partnership agreements, we have association agreements, we have deep and comprehensive agreements, we have development support. I mean, we have embedded many of these countries in very tight cooperation, so there are different platforms where you can discuss issues, even if they're not distinctly in the trade agreements as well. A long answer to to your questions.
Mr. Ash wants to pick up on that.
Just to add 2 points, I mean, FTAs cannot address domestic policy failures, period. So, you know, when you have countries that are relatively compatible, if that's what you would describe the EU and Canada as being, it's possible to do more. There's other countries where EU standards would be something that would be dreamt of and would not be achievable in the short and medium term, thinking across a very wide range of policy fields. So I think the balance is, it depends on the partners. And it depends whether or not the agreement is seeking hard bindings with dispute settlement, or best endeavours with capacity building, or initial transparency type provisions. So if you're in it for the long haul, there's many levers to be played aside from just the law.
Mm.
If I just pass over to the right-hand side, one of the things I wanted to ask was the I guess provisions or the chapters related to labour are often criticised in terms of their enforceability. Now, one of your suggestion includes a kind of an element or a layer of enforceability, but interestingly, you're saying that the suspension of benefits should come last. And you are adopting what you call a monetarisation, so in other words, basically a fine approach. And just how would that work? And for Ms. Varga, clearly, as the standard bearer of labour rights, what do you think should be included? Beyond, perhaps it's just the core labour standards, or beyond.
Perhaps firstly on the question of labour standards. I'm totally convinced that we have a set of universal labour law. It's not depending if you have a developing or a developed country. This is similar to human rights core labour standards. And there, the question of collective bargaining and freedom of association is one of them. And of course we have different concrete legislation in different countries. But looking to Bangladesh, without a change in the labour law, it gives the right to create trade unions and collective bargaining, you will never give better wages and will never get safety for the company. So there is a set of universal labor law. And this has to be guaranteed. And indeed, we want to have compliance enforceable. And that is perhaps this third step. Of course, also some positive element in dialogue and promotion is there. So that you have to capacity building, support, and so on. No doubt about, and there are a lot of studies having this differentiation between the promotion system and the sanction system. And I'm convinced that we have to find a way in the middle because we have positive elements on both. But the problem in our current European system is that there is not really a possibility to trigger, especially from the side of the trade unions and from the workers, this dispute settlement mechanism. You are only relying on the party-to-party settlement mechanism. And this has to be changed, and therefore we give more right to the domestic advisory groups, and we give the right to individual workers and to trade unions to trigger such a process. That's, I think, a really important improvement. And yes, the last step of an escalation journey would be the deletion of some trade preferences. But this would be not have impact to the concrete violation of labor rights. So that would have impact perhaps to other workers or to other companies. And therefore, I think the financial compensation is the right way, especially with a clear obligation to put the money in the problem this dispute was based on. By the way, this is not also not revolutionary. Even I'm a social democrat, but in some agreements we have also the possibility of financial compensation. But we focus a little bit on our draft in this direction, and I think really intelligent to give the partner country the possibility to give financial compensation and therefore avoid the question of reduction in tariffs.
And Ms. Varga, I'd ask you specific questions, but also you can pick up on what you referred.
Let me first go to your specific question. Should the trade agreement go beyond fundamental principles and rights at work, so the core labor rights? As a matter of fact, most trade agreements currently go beyond the core labor rights to include working terms and conditions, in particular occupational safety and health, wage and working time. Let me just pick up on working time. If we go back again to the research presented this earlier by Vietnam, we see working time is really a key issue that nearly all research are pointing to the fact that working hours are far too long in many of these exporting companies. So working time is an issue. Occupational safety and health, that's basic human rights, so I think no one can challenge that. And then we've also heard Vietnam, the question of wage, workers being paid minimum wage. So there are indeed labor standards fixing international regulation on all these issues. Then comes the second question, is this too much? Are we asking too much? Well, let me just remind everyone that international labor standards have their main objective is to create a level playing field between member states, so hence between trading partners. So in addition to that, our research has really found no evidence that would substantiate the argument that labor provisions are diverting trade and reducing the benefits of trade. To the contrary. So with these two arguments, that they create a level playing field and that there is no evidence that labor provision would hinder trade or reduce the benefits. So I think these arguments would support the view that the trade agreement should indeed go beyond the simple core labor standards to include minimum occupational safety and health, working time and wage. And this would encompass what in the ILO we have been calling unacceptable forms of work. So that would be my answer.
Well, this finishes. This opens the floor up to questions here. I will take the first, I think, from ETUC. Is that right, Mr. Jenkins? Obviously, we have a trade union member on the panel, so perhaps you go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks to the FES for organising this very interesting meeting, which is part of a whole week of discussions on what interests us most amongst the unions when it comes to trade, and that's the question of labour rights in trade agreements. First, I'd like to thank the FES and Chairman Lange for producing a draft labour chapter, which I think goes in the right direction, in that it goes in the direction we would like it to go. There are a few points which I might mention if I have time later on. I also would like to thank the Commissioner for saying that her paper will be launched very soon. Now, we've been waiting for that paper. We were told by the summer we'll all be going on holidays, and I hope that we'll be able to talk about it. In a way, it's a bit of a pity we don't have it today, so that we could comment in a bit more detail. But I must say I'm a little bit worried, Commissioner, when basically you're saying that we should more or less keep the system as it is, whilst improving implementation, etc. My experience in particular is with the Korea DAG, and I don't think that we can just improve the implementation. It needs something else added to it. But at the moment, I just learned a couple of weeks ago, the EU-Korea FTA does not even have an implementation of how do you engage in consultations. I found it quite weird, that after several years that we wrote to Mr. de Gucht, and after that earlier this year we wrote to you, asking for consultation to be put in train. Apparently there isn't even anything written into the FTA about how you can do that, and apparently DG Trade are now scrambling around, cutting and pasting bits from the EU-Colombia FTA to send to the Koreans. Well, a good thing that the Koreans will suddenly realise that the EU wants to do something, but it's been 5 years since we've been asking for action to be taken. Now, I take the point that you've got a new government coming up, and hopefully things will ameliorate there. But we're now talking about chapters for future FTAs, and I think that perhaps CETA should come into that category. After all, there is an agreement that the labour chapter in CETA will be reviewed, and I hope that the first attempt of implementing what the FES and Bernd Lange are proposing would be with CETA. I haven't read it all in detail, but my impression is that it is an attempt to merge the best of the EU, US and Canadian systems. And I think that that's the way forward. And I think that you do, at the end of the day, need some kind of enforcement mechanism, some kind of economic consequence if there is a violation. And I think that's one key point. Two quick ones on the draft as I've seen it. Firstly, and by the way, Commissioner, I knew you'd mention Guatemala. You always mention Guatemala, even before it didn't, the ruling came along. But why did the ruling go the way it was? And I have a colleague here from the FLCIO who can tell you more chapter and verse. But the fact is that one great failing in the American system is that it talks about trade-related issues. And the judgment went the wrong way because of the interpretation of what trade-related is. Now, as I understand it, the proposals from Lange FES is that trade-related does not apply in our proposal, and I think that this is an excellent point. Another point is the question of the independence.
Can I just hurry up slightly? We want to get some other questions as well.
Just one point on the independence of the of what we would like to see as an independent secretariat within the machinery. I have a question to Bernd there, because he says rightly that a trade union could put in a complaint, but there is to whom do you complain? Do you complain straight to the panel of experts? I think that does need looking at. Now, I know I'm stealing a lot of other people's time, so I'll shut up now. But thank you very much for the invitation.
Okay, well, I think you nodded at the last question, so it would go to the panel of experts. Yep. And there were a number of questions, including, for example, related to CETA and related to Korea, which I think were addressed to you, Ms. Malmström.
Yes, on Korea, I have said several times that we are ready to go to the next phase with them, and I have raised this with the former Korean government several times, and we have talked about this, and I think they have a very good idea what we were trying to do in there. Now, I will go to Korea just after the summer, meeting the new government. We have heard that they are more open to labour rights. I hope that is correct, because then we can advance on this. If not, we will take that next step. On CETA, these two processes are parallel. We have agreed that as soon that CETA enters into force, we will start reviewing not only labour rights, but the whole sustainable development chapter. I would like to emphasise this, that it is much broader than only labour rights. And we will, and we talked about this when we met, that we will start doing this. I also informed the Canadian government of the process that we are starting basically today, and with different other events, and that will go on for several months, I hope, and I'm looking forward to your more concrete contribution to this, and I will also study more in detail your proposals. So that is one process that will be in CETA. Obviously, the Canadians have their views, we will have ours, and in parallel, we will discuss how we can strengthen the enforcement in future trade agreements in Europe. And this is a debate, I hope, that will run in parallel, and hopefully we will during the autumn. So they sort of cross-fertilise each other, these two debates. And I think it is, as I think you meant as well, it's excellent to start with our Canadian friends, because they have a very progressive view on these issues, and they have lots of good ideas that we have already learned from. We have hopefully a few good ideas as well to share with them, and that can be a very fruitful process.
You, just a reminder, perhaps, to keep your questions relatively short. I think the woman in blue, I think you were the first.
I'm sorry. Now there are two trade unionists, one after another. I'm Lina Carr from the Trade Union Confederation. Tom has said lots of things already that I would have said if the floor had been the other way around. But what I want to emphasise, and which actually came very clearly across in Mrs. Vargas's intervention, is just two words: political will. If there is no political will, we can have all sorts of wonderful chapters, and this is actually the experience, and I think this is the major dispute at the moment between the trade unions and the Commission, is precisely that Commission is saying that we have the enforceable mechanism, we are saying we don't. And I see as the biggest problem precisely that the Commission, as Tom pointed out, has refused to take up our consistent complaints about the conditions in Korea. So if we had political will, and the process would have actually been taken forward, as it stands, the weak process provided by the Korean FTA, perhaps we would be in a different place today. I also want to thank Bernd Lange and FES for putting this model chapter on the table. We are also starting our work, so it's a wonderful point also for our trade union work, and we really look forward with interest to the Commission document, which we were hoping to get already this week, but which would be good before the discussion on Monday, because on Monday afternoon there is an event, a technical level event on the Commission document on trade and sustainable development chapters. So it would be good to actually see the document before. Just two more comments and then I conclude. Guatemala. I think if we talk about the two sort of parts of the trade agreements, or we have the trade part, we have the sustainable development part. The level of proof, the burden of proof, should be the same in both parts. At the moment, we have the situation when in the North American agreements, the level of proof for labour rights is actually considerably higher. There are 2-tier sort of burden of proof. For business, it isn't. It's much easier. So let's have the same level of proof. Let's have the same level playing field as we are trying to create through the trade agreements. And coming back to Korea, I think whether the mechanisms in agreements are triggered or not, it shouldn't be dependent entirely on the partner country, because clearly no country wants to have a sort of procedure triggered against them. But if there is very clearly and very visibly violations of labour rights, the mechanism should be triggered despite the unwillingness of the partner country.
Okay, well,
yes, we have been discussing this with South Korea many, many times, and I think that accusation is not correct. I can show you plenty of letters. I can show you writing downs of meetings I have had with the minister where I have raised it many, many times. And I announced that we would be ready to evoke the mechanism. Then they announced an election because of the events in South Korea and the president, which was a bit unexpected for us. And then I think it is fair when there is a new government that you at least wait for them to come into place before you, in the vacuum between the two governments, do such a thing for the first time. But I have raised it in person with the minister several times. I have written letters. Many other colleagues have also raised it. So it's not true that we have just neglected it. But the European tradition, which I think has worked well, not saying that it cannot improve, is that before we trigger anything, we seek dialogue. And this is how the European Union has worked for 60 years, and I think this is the main element. We seek dialogue first, we seek it again, and then if it doesn't work, then we can look at other matters. But you have to start with a dialogue before you just trigger a mechanism. I think you agree with that. That's also how many trade unions work, no?
Indeed, and this is in our draft as well, the dialogue, no doubt about. But of course we have to reflect, and that's perhaps a lesson learned of the Korean agreement, that at one moment then the domestic advisory group should have the right to trigger a claim, because now at the moment we are really depending on the willingness of a partner. And this is under certain conditions and so on, you can read it in our proposal, so that there is a direct possibility, not a necessity, but a possibility, and even, Tom, for trade unions, so that they can go direct to the panel of experts, so that this partner-to-partner dispute is the second step, so that we can really go direct and find a solution also under several conditions, so that not everybody can go to the panel of experts. That's also for clear.
Okay, I don't know whether you guys want to add anything. No, not on the. Okay, all right. Sorry, another question at the back. Yep.
Well, unavoidably, trade unions again. The International Trade Union Confederation of Trade Unions this time. So the problem with what the Commissioner says is that it's up to the judgment of the Commissioner or her staff to see whether there is really a case for a consultations, formal consultations, or whatever mechanism there is in other agreements. So, and what we have been calling for consistently is something much more drafted, a more legal text where provides for what business calls predictability. Of if a country crosses one or two or three boundaries, then the launching of a dispute is inevitable. And then in this way, the dispute settlement triggering part, which I understand it's difficult for DigiTrade to deal with, is depoliticized much more. So a better drafting and a more clear rules and criteria would solve this problem. We have the same problem with the GSP Plus, for instance, where a special paragraph in the ILC would do the work. Then finally, they would need, the Commission was telling us that they would need 2 special paragraphs adopted in the ILC for a particular country, and then that politicized the situation in the ILC. This year, the employers group in the ILC was rejecting to put Bangladesh on the list because it would be the second time in a row and therefore the EU would have to trigger its own mechanism and withdraw the preferences probably, and then therefore they did everything possible not to do it, which kind of started having an impact on how the ILC works. So it should be clear and if possible not connected with the very political already procedures in the ILO. Although that's not to say that the ILO should not have a role. In fact, they should be on the experts panel, etc. And then my last point would be that, well, as Ken Ash said, that trade agreements cannot address domestic policy failures, which is something that we completely disagree with. Because you can see that in the United Nations Guiding Principles process, or in the discussion of the ILC on supply chains last year, they are talking about governance gaps, and that's what these domestic policy failures really are. Poor implementation, enforcement of labour standards in countries like Bangladesh. And there are two issues there. One is the capacity one, which we are always, yes, it should be a capacity issue first of all. Maybe a country does not have money enough for its labour inspectorate, but it cannot be a country that all of a sudden, when there is a strike, they know who to throw in jail, like Bangladesh, for instance. So, but the second thing is, and which is the most often, is what Lina Carr said, political will, lacking political will. And in this case, there is no other way than to instrumentalize the huge market power, the biggest market power in the world this time, EU, to instrumentalize this power in order to make political successes. And that's why I completely endorse the proposal of Bernd Lange, and ITUC will be with that. I'm not talking about the text. The text is something that, of course, we need to discuss first, and I haven't had the time to read, but your suggestion of empowering the DAGs, for instance, to trigger this type of disputes, that could then lead to something like sanctions. Yes, let's discuss it, but it should be in the end of the road. It would offer this depoliticization and at the same time having the effect on creating political will in countries like Bangladesh and Korea and others to take those commitments seriously.
Well, maybe I should start with Ken, because he was under attack there, to give him a chance to respond.
I was thinking about a way to work in that I enjoy very much being in Brussels on a panel with the Commissioner, because I talk for 5 minutes, people listen mostly politely, and then she gets all the questions. But I had to get it in somehow. You broke them all. Let me just make 2 points. Look, a lot of RTAs include, as we've heard, various mechanisms associated with labour standards. Some of them do a lot to encourage implementation and compliance with other international standards, particularly ILO. Some of them try to go a little further and strengthen and make stronger. I think the jury's out, so maybe I simply disagree with you, that a trade agreement sanction is the best or the only way to improve labor conditions in various countries. So for me, our conversation at the OECD is ongoing, and we haven't reached the conclusion that trade sanctions are the right mechanism. The second point, when I referred to policy, when I referred to domestic policy failures, I wasn't talking just about labour. I was talking about the full suite. That's why we see, 30 chapters in an economic and trade agreement. It's covering a lot more than just labour. And if you disagree with me on domestic policy failures, you must disagree with the ILO as well, who talked about the importance of policy coherence.
And Commissioner, a couple of points made in relation to trying to make the texts more sort of predictable.
No, I get your point. I see what you mean. It's not. I see what you mean. I took good note. I saw it more as a sort of contribution to the debate. It's not very easy to do that. of course, because when exactly is the red line, when has it been crossed? Because there's so many other issues. But I take it as a contribution to the debate. It merits reflection. On Bangladesh, I am also very concerned, and we might move in that direction very soon, because there is no other way. But it's not very easy to define those red lines, especially for developing countries who are struggling with a lot of issues. But I saw it more as I took note. Yeah.
Okay. You have taken a note.
Yeah, there's a disagreement from
ILO. Sure.
On this time, I would like, because I had not picked up the point made earlier by Mr. Ash about the trade agreement cannot address domestic policy failure, and I think I would challenge that. Certainly in the area of labour policy failure, I think evidence is suggesting that trade agreements can support addressing labour policy failure at national level, and this does not mean that by challenging you on that argument, I disagree with you on the policy coherence argument. I just don't see the link between those two the way you do. But yeah, I just wanted to make it quite clear that I think your statement about, I take it that trade agreement cannot address everything on earth and every single domestic policy failures, but however, evidence is suggesting that with respect to labour policy failures, there is evidence that's suggesting that there is impact and that we can even further improve the impact of those.
Let me agree with the ILO. Let's be really clear with each other. If we look to trade agreements to address everything, then I think we have fundamental problems and we lose legitimacy for what trade agreements, which by definition would no longer be trade agreements, they would be economic integration, something or others, then I think that's a problem. Can provisions on labor in trade agreements move the goalpost in a positive direction? Yes. So if that's splitting the baby in two, then I guess that's what I did.
Perhaps. Are you from a labour organisation as well?
I am. Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for being here. My name is Celeste Drake. I'm with the AFL-CIO, which is the American Trade Union Confederation. And thanks for this draft document. I think it makes a good discussion paper. And I just wanted to respond a little bit to this Guatemala case that Commissioner Malmström referenced and seemed to, if I understood her correctly, kind of dismiss out of hand the idea of binding dispute settlement with trade sanctions for labor provisions simply because of the fact of the Guatemala case was such a failure. And I don't think the Guatemala case was such a failure because it's too difficult to prove that Guatemala is not effectively enforcing its labor laws. In fact, it's quite clear to the ILO that Guatemala has a problem. It's quite clear to the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights that Guatemala has a problem. It has to do with what is the structure of the labor chapter in the Central American Free Trade Agreement. And as it was written, you have no deadlines, which is what caused the case to go on for 9 years. It didn't take 9 years to determine that there's a problem with how workers are treated in Guatemala. It has to do with the fact that there was nothing mandatory about the enforcement. At every step, it was a party may, a party may, a party may. And I see some of that, a party may, in this draft chapter, so I'd like some reflections on that. But it also has to do with this two-tier system. So as the panel took it, in the question of first instance, there had never been such a labor dispute panel before, it divided up the case into several elements. First, the U.S. had to prove, has Guatemala failed to effectively enforce its laws? Was that failure sustained or recurring? Did that failure also form a course of action or inaction? And was it in a manner affecting trade? So even in the many cases where there were failures, the panel said, well, they didn't prove that it was in a manner affecting trade, and even when they did, they failed to prove that that was sustained or recurring. So the question is the chapter set up to be something that makes it easier for members of parliament or members of Congress to vote yes on because they can say, look, it's got labor in it? Or is it designed to be something that's really quite enforceable? Because I'm convinced that negotiators really know how to write an enforceable provision when they want to. And I would say CNISDS provision. So, I mean, it's quite clear how to make enforcement easy, and it's quite clear how to make enforcement hard. And I guess I would say, and ask for some responses further to this question of, you know, if trade agreements might lose their legitimacy if they address too much. I would posit that for many people, trade agreements have already lost their legitimacy, and I would reference the failure of the TPP in the United States and the collapse of the TTIP here, and to say trade agreements we know, and the OECD produced some good work on this recently, they do actually sometimes harm what's happening domestically and take away what were strong trade unions and good bargaining leverage. So isn't it the obligation, if you're going to include incentives that make things worse for working people, that you figure out in a policy way how to balance that and provide the opposite incentive so that workers are gaining rather than losing? And I'll stop there. Thank you.
I don't know if anybody wants to pick up on that. And obviously, clearly, TTIP has not failed. It is merely being kept in the freezer for the time being.
Yes, I think it's not really fair to compare what happened with TPP in the US and what happened to TTIP here. We are waiting for, we put it in the freezer. And well, I think we have different views on this, so I don't want to engage in a political discussion. I am convinced that trade agreements do help workers a lot. It creates a lot of jobs, a lot of growth, and it has had positive impact on several sustainable development elements as well. Not saying that we can't improve. Of course we can. We do. And I would say that the EU trade agreements are the most ambitious in the world, with the strongest sustainability development chapters, for instance. And yes, we can discuss the Guatemala case. Nobody disputes that there are violations of labour rights in Guatemala. I think, no, I did not do that. And if that's how you interpreted me, I was unclear. I just say that case failed. And maybe you can construct it in a different way. It's just that if you talk about sanctions, as in the current system in Canada and the North America, there is no case. There's no successful case that you can say this was a good example. So that's why, I remain to be convinced that this is a good way to do with it, because the EU chapters, they are enforceable. They are not sanction-based, but they are enforceable. Yes, they are. They lead to obligatory consultations where we involve civil society, and in several countries, and there is a lot of research, we have actually managed to mobilise civil society where it has been traditionally weak. In Colombia, in Peru. We could have done more. I'm not saying we can't improve, but they are enforceable.
Go.
Just on the point that you made, whether or not trade agreements have gone too far or haven't gone far enough, it's a conversation. You've heard different views today. The reason that we have focused so much of our work at the OECD on talking about domestic policies that matter for the distribution of the benefits of openness, the need for policies to facilitate more inclusive, more widely distributed benefits from growth, and then how do you do that internationally? Via trade agreements or via soft law and conventions and guidelines and principles and so on. In my view, it's that whole suite of things, and you have to be as opportunistic and you have to move forward when you can move. So we resist sort of quick solutions, because quite often, and I think that some of the work you're referring to has revealed that there are unintended impacts from really well-intentioned initiatives.
There are two. So do you want to? No.
Yeah. Quite short. Of course, you have to create an integrated policy. So trade policy is one part of the exercise, and domestic policy is the other side. And I think the example of the election of Mr. Trump in the United States makes it totally clear that the domestic policy is not adequate to the challenge because of globalization. And therefore, the new paper of the Commission is the right way, even the part of external dimension is much more concrete than the domestic part, and we have to work on. But nevertheless, we have to really be coherent in our policy. Just making free trade and don't look to the consequences internally, it makes no sense. So we have to be really coherent.
Okay, there were two questions at the back, and I'm going to give the priority to the person who's not from a labour organisation, merely for... Oh, you're both. Okay, well... Fantastic. Well, okay, well, in which case... Sure, there's a third one. Okay, all right. Well, I'll take, simply because I saw you first, the woman at the back there.
Hello, I'm from an environmental organisation, so not from a trade union. My name is Mute Schimpf. I have one question to you, Mr. Lange. Thanks for working on this model, how a model chapter could look like for workers. But the current S&D chapters also include environmental issues. So I'm wondering who is developing now a model for the environmental enforcement mechanism? Because this is the current structure, or what is your vision how we should go ahead with the current sustainable development chapter? And then I have more reflection about this for you, Mr. Ash. I think I read some pieces of a paper that the OECD published last week or 2 weeks ago about the impact on working conditions and labour from various developments, including trade liberalisation. And if I got it right, actually, I mean, the wording was quite reluctant, but actually you raised questions how much evidence we have that trade liberalisations have increased working conditions, working security and working quality. And I mean, we don't need to comment on the papers from the Commissioner Malmström, sorry. I mean, what you published on TTIP was derailed by NGOs and trade unions within the first 2 years, that with all these predictions how much jobs would be created by TTIP, I mean, this was clearly a myth. But I'm more interested by the OECD paper, if you can say a bit more how substantiated are actually the facts that trade liberalisation contributes to better jobs, to more job security and to better working conditions. Thanks.
Do you want to take? No.
Sure, pretty substantiated, or we wouldn't have published it. I think the paper you're referring to is this one here. All of the references are there, and in fact, I think that particular conclusion came from an initiative that we launched back in 2010, the International Collaborative Initiative on Trade and Employment, where we were trying to pull together what was known and not known about trade, growth, jobs, and working conditions. The report was signed off by, I think, 11 international organizations, including the ones represented at this table and many that are not represented at the table. And I think it's pretty unequivocal. The relationship between trade and growth is clear. The relationship between trade and jobs, not so clear. The relationship between trade and working conditions, clear. That there is a positive benefit in terms of a whole range of things, working hours, working conditions, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm happy to, if you want to see me after, or just go online. It's all available.
As I said, we have slightly less than 15 minutes. I've seen there's one question, and another question. So maybe you can kind of pitch your question fairly quickly.
Yeah, so it's more of a comment than a question, actually. My name's Liam Campling. I'm at Queen Mary University of London. I am also a trade unionist, so, you know. The kind of problem that I want to raise is the question of one-size-fits-all approaches. And we've been working as a team at University of London and University of Warwick for 2 years looking at EU free trade agreements and the labour standards contained therein. And we started not in Brussels, we started in partner countries. So we looked at Moldova, South Korea and Guyana, and then came back to Brussels from there. What we found is that many of the labour-related issues are beyond the core labour standards, so that's a kind of a major kind of concern. What we also found is that the views of what is civil society and who should be part of a domestic advisory group are very different in each place, including the kind of thorny question and difficult question of unorganised labour, which of course is a major issue. Third, we also found that many of the kind of issues the labour-related issues are specific to particular global value chains, and that's why the first presentation was so crucial in that regard, I think, which raises a couple of thoughts for possibility of change. So one, the issue of side agreements, whether or not side agreements could be an effective mechanism to try and target particularly difficult labour conditions. You know, context matters. Also, whether kind of the FES kind of model chapter lays out a series of possible sanctions, whether or not sanctions could be differentiated. So rather than having a sanction across an entire country or by sector or even kind of firm specific, so you can really kind of target, for example, reducing tariff preferences. And the EU would very often argue that it couldn't do this, it couldn't use its market power in this way, but it's exactly what it does with its EU-IUU regulation, which is very targeted on particular countries, particular sectors, and very often drills down to particular firms in terms of the demands that are required, and that's exactly using its market power to implement change, very effectively in some places, including in South Korea, by the way. Or whether or not there's also a possibility of incentives. So, for example, relaxed rules of origin, improved preferences, if you comply and are a particularly good player. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, I think that was, probably less of a question and as you say, more of a point. I think on the far side over there.
Thank you. I'm actually from a member state. I'm a representative of the Belgian government. I'm the director for the trade policy. And I emphasize that because I'm coming from a member state which is a founding member state of the European Union, but also of the ILO. And for us, those bilateral free trade agreements are a potent means, certainly, to support the work of ILO. And we see an interesting connection between, on the one hand, the bilateral approach, which is the one of free trade agreements, but also of the multilateral approach. And in our reflection, an ongoing reflection, indeed, to increase the better implementation of sustainable development chapters and labour norms and environmental norms in free trade agreements, in our ongoing reflection, we also try to find the best way to support the multilateral approach of the ILO. And I must say that I miss this a bit in the discussion that we have had so far, because the expression level playing field was mentioned at one point. For us, as a founding member state of yet another organisation, the WTO, for us, of course, the ultimate goal would be for a multilateral solution to all those issues. And that's why I'm just wondering a bit. I mean, I've heard, the usual debate about sanctions, no sanctions. But I would like to hear as well, maybe from the representative of the ILO, how you perceive the support that can be given by bilateral free trade agreements to your work, also to the interpretation of those conventions, because if at one point one needs to assess that a country is in violation of certain conventions, not the fact that they have not ratified it, that's pretty clear and easy to establish. But if they're not implementing it properly, then one would need to have really the finer detail, the finer interpretation of the organisation that you're representing. So it's just really the relation between, on the one hand, this bilateral instrument that we have with free trade agreements, and on the other hand, the very useful work that has been done for a much longer time than even the EU existed by ILO that I would be interested to hear about. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I'll take it. And thank you for sharing with us, actually, that the Belgian government is currently undertaking some reflection, and I'll be interested to know more outside of the room about that. But now, turning to your question about the support by the bilateral parties to multilateral organization, I think you're pointing to something, a critical aspect of the debate moving forward. I mean, the ILO has pre-existed indeed all these trade agreements and has been called upon to interact with these bilateral signing parties in many different ways. And in these, there is no one-size-fits-all. I just want to confirm that that has been also our approach and our experience so far. Having said that, what we tailor is how we can help member states improve their institutional setup, their legal framework, and their enforcement mechanism. And that's to be tailored to country context and realities. Now, the support of signing parties to the ILO multilateral system, and I'm just going to be addressing that part of your question. And I'm going to relate this also to some element contained in the draft chapter where there is also reference to possible roles of the ILO. I think we need to be mindful and careful about how to maximize synergies and complementarities and be very mindful of the risk of duplication or even unproductive parallel processes on occasions. It's easy to put the question on the table. I think it's far more complex to address it in full detail. But one way to certainly avoid all this negative or counterproductive impact would be for bilateral parties to fully use what's coming out of the International Labour Organization in terms of not only its production of labour standards, but its supervision of how member states are implementing labour standards. It's being done already, it's being used already, but if that can remain the central piece, and I'm saying this because you talked about interpretation. There I'm a bit worried when I'm hearing that interpretation could come from any other places than from the ILO with respect to international labour standards. Well, for those of you familiar with the ILO, you even know that that's a difficult discussion within the ILO itself, so not to mention outside the ILO. So one critical way of supporting that is by making sure that the sole reference point remains the ILO labour standards, its body of standards, and the outcome of the various supervisory mechanisms we do have. And that triggers the question of how to make sure that whatever mechanism is contained in a trade agreement, and legitimately so, is maximizing the outcome of the ILO supervisory system. And so the timing and the sequencing, in your draft chapter, you sort of suggest that at this point in time, at least in what's on the table, that parties would have first to exhaust national recourses before being able to access what is suggested in terms of mechanism there. The ILO supervisory system does not call for that condition. So in a way, that would enable the ILO supervisory system to be actioned already before any other mechanism can be triggered, and so at least those mechanisms could be informed then about what's coming out of the ILO. So just to conclude on my comment, I think on my response to you, the best way to strengthen the multilateral system in its contribution and the synergies and complementarities would be to make it the sole reference and use it to the best possible extent what's coming out of the ILO. I hope it did address somehow your question.
And of course, there's a further link. So the request for ratification of the core labor standards enable, of course, trade union to use the monitoring process and the claim at ILO. And by the way, the Canadian trade unions are the most efficient of using this instrument. If you read the statistics about the claims at ILO, you can think that in Canada we have the most worst labor situation in the world because they are using this instrument the most. But if you have the ratification, then of course you can use this instrument, and perhaps some other trade unions in other countries should use it more.
If I may just second what has been said, because I think this was an a very useful complement in addition to what I said. I mean, one other way of strengthening is indeed by joining this campaign for ratification and making sure, because that's when you have the level playing field.
Okay. Well, I'm mindful of the fact that we have 2 minutes left. We had 2 questions. So if you can make your interjection or question within 30 seconds each, perhaps you...
I will try to be as short. One question would be in question in the direction of the colleague of the USO, because if you say trade policy cannot indeed undo the domestic problems, you are working together with the ILO on the decent work agenda. What then, if not using the trade policies, do we have as instruments to push the decent work agenda forwards? Because in a way, sometimes I think we are trying to win an unwinnable uphill battle. And soft law on its own is not changing domestic policy. The other question would be, if we are talking about sanctions on the labour law, who's going to pay the price? Is the company being fined for? Is the government paying? So
okay, so who will pay?
Yeah.
And then.
Perfect. I had a question regarding CETA. So I was wondering how the framework you're talking about with CETA, so this, sharing ideas and maybe possibility of convergence for labor laws, is going to help you in future trade negotiations with developing countries, because obviously it's going to be very different to deal with developing countries when your only experience of that will have been with Canada. Thank you.
A few points there, whereas again, maybe if you can reply in 30 seconds, that would also be useful.
Sure. Again, I mean, trade agreements cannot solve everything. Can trade agreements reinforce international standards, including in the area of labor, including in particular those developed at the ILO? Yes, of course. One of the big concerns is about the distribution of the benefits of trade opening. Trade agreements will not address that. Domestic policy need to. But there are many, many standards that can be reinforced, maybe even strengthened through provisions in trade agreements. And we see that in some 25 or 30 that have been presented to the WTO, for example.
Anyone else?
The partner has to pay. That's the principle, and then of course you can have the domestic procedures to get it back. Of course, we want to have a standard, a blueprint, and on the other side, it's clear that we have to reflect the capacity in different countries. But the 8 core labor standards are acceptable, I guess, for all countries worldwide.
As I said, there are 2 processes. We agreed with the Canadian government that we would start looking at the Sustainable Development chapter in there, so we can improve standards between us, but also how we can cooperate jointly to help spread them in other countries. That is one exercise. But then the exercise that we are having now, how we can improve the enforceability of our sustainability development. There, of course, we do have experience. We have from Latin America, from Asia, from Georgia, and others. So we do have experience. And I agree, of course, Canada, even if we are looking at that as a role model for trade agreements, what we can do with Canada is not exactly what we can do with Laos. There has to be certain case by case, even if some core standards, I agree with you, will always be there.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much indeed. I often kind of think the most boring panel is where everybody agrees. So while nobody's actually exchanged any blows here, this has been a healthy panel, obviously with some sort of disagreement about what trade agreements can and cannot cover. I hope I can encourage you to applaud the members of the panel, which are Ms. Varga, Mr. Lange, Ms. Malmström and Mr. Ash for coming and giving their comments.